Please start. Good evening to one and all. I am Anshula Mehta, Assistant Director at Impact and Policy Research Institute, IMPRI, New Delhi, and I welcome you all to episode 20 of our talk series, The State of Gender Equality, #Gender Gaps, organized by the Gender Impact Studies Center at IMPRI, along with GenDev Center for Research and Innovation and Delhi Post. Today we have with us Dr. Smita Kumar, speaking on intimate partner violence and the paradoxical role of paid work for middle-class women in abusive relationships. It's my pleasure to introduce her to you all. In the last 20 years, Dr. Smita Kumar has performed varied roles, from teacher and researcher to community worker, yoga instructor, HR leader, and activist. She pursued a doctoral degree after 12 years of a successful corporate career. Her dissertation was motivated by her personal experience of partner violence, allowing her to understand the empowering role of work for middle-class women in abusive relationships. She has since embarked on a journey as a researcher activist, engaging in research on intimate partner violence and work-family spillover, researcher self-care, and transformative learning in students through mindfulness. She is driven by research that empowers researchers and communities and has the potential to drive social change. After a doctorate from the George Washington University, Washington, D.C., Dr. Kumar taught courses at the Indian Institute of Management, Bengaluru, and currently she is an assistant professor of human resource development at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Al Akhawayn University, Ifran, Morocco. She is presently engaged in 2 studies on intimate partner violence. The first study aims to understand the work-family spillover in Indian middle-class women who experience intimate partner abuse and ethical dimensions of organizational engagement. The second research is motivated by the current pandemic. In this study, Dr. Kumar is exploring how working from home during COVID-19 has impacted employees who experience partner abuse. These research projects have led her to engage in establishing a corporate alliance to end domestic violence in India. This alliance will bring together public and private organizations, domestic violence services organizations, counseling and mental health professional organizations, and academia to collaborate in research, policy development, advocacy, training, and capability building focused towards employee well-being and safe workplaces, preventing negative impact of intimate partner violence on employees and employers. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining us today to deliver a talk on this very pertinent and very needed discussion. And we also have our chair for today, Professor Govind Kilkar, who is chairperson of the Gender Impact Studies Center at IMPRI and executive director of the GenDev Center for Research and Innovation. So without further ado, ma'am, I would hand over to you, Professor Kilkar, to make your initial remarks and then invite Dr. Kumar to make a presentation.
A very warm welcome to Professor Kumar and their discussant Doris Gray and Professor Doris Gray as well as Professor Nandani Mudali. I, like all of us, I am also really quite surprised at the violence against women within home. It's not that the violence does not exist outside home. It does exist in public streets and workplaces. But when violence at home exists, it really talks about the serious violation of the human rights in the so-called nurturing home. And where do people grow? And probably how many of us are subject to this kind of violence? This is the in the stated and non-stated figures that we want to learn from you. What is the nature of this family? And as much earlier pointed out by Engels, that is also that state and family have to wither away as the nature if really we want independence of women. And we really remember both Engels and Rosa Luxemburg in this connection, which is very important. How it has persisted and how it has kind of endured over time. With changing times, it has increased. With modernization, it has increased, as we know, and both in corporate and non-corporate structures. In the so-called capitalist nature of the economy, the junkie capitalism, but at the same time also it has traditional roots And that also we need to really, I'm surprised not yet able to figure out. I just completed a book on witch hunts in the traditional indigenous societies of India, early modern Europe and Africa. And then we find these two roots kind of thing, the two sources of the violence. So that's why I was talking about. So really look forward to hearing you, Professor Kumar. And I just learned that you have done your dissertation. And I'm really addressing this question with all of us, that how do we end this violence and create a kind of democratic institution of the family and the society, that is where women can live with basic dignity of a human life. Thank you. Smita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Govind Kelkar. Thank you so much. And your topics are, and the points that you've raised are so pertinent, that how do we really end this? And sometimes when we are engaged in this kind of work and we keep seeing the violence, it can be very disheartening and you wonder whether there is any end to it that you can see. However, we will go ahead and see at least what is the lay of the land. Thank you, Anshula Mehta, for your kind introduction. Thank you, IMPRI. Thank you, Dr. Arjun and Dr. Simi, for holding these gender gap series. I have been fortunate to attend some of your sessions in the last couple of months, and it has been very timely, very relevant, and very impactful. And I have learned a lot through that. I also want to thank Dr. Doris Gray and Dr. Nandani Mudali for being the discussant for this session. And I thank all the people who have interest in this area and who have made time to be here today. So thank you so much. So yes, in terms of really looking at the lay of the land, before I begin, as Anshula was talking about in the introduction about my lived experience, so I will start with that, because if that didn't happen, then I won't be here and I won't be talking about this study or even working on this area. So it was almost 20 years ago when I got married, and I married my classmate. And of course, at that time, you don't have any example or any experience or reference of this. And so I didn't expect anything untoward to happen. But 3 months or a few months after the marriage, the abuse started. It was initially more verbal and emotional or psychological. And you keep thinking about it. And at least at that time, I was rationalizing it as just one-off case, bad day, bad mood, bad temper, all of those things. And little did I know that it would really get into extreme levels of physical and sexual abuse. And when that happens, in the beginning, you're really shocked. So it was shock, it was denial, you're ashamed. You don't know who to reach out to, what to do, who to speak to about it. But as you move on, you realize that you've gotten trapped into what is called the cycle of abuse. And at that time, I didn't know about it, of course. It is like when there is a trigger to an incident, then the incident of abuse happens, then there is reconciliation, and then you move into a calm phase. It is actually during the reconciliation phase is when people start internalizing abuse. And when the spouse is apologizing to you, you actually start thinking that maybe I did something too to trigger this. So there is this self-blame. And of course, from the social context, you're also hearing a lot of victim blaming. So that's really the tricky part, when you start normalizing abuse and you're like, it's okay. It was one-off, it'll get fine, and you keep moving in that cycle. While that was happening at a personal level, at a professional level, I was working at an organization, a large multinational, that was setting operations in India in those days. And I was very fortunate that very early in my career, I got a chance to work with them. I got very, I would say, interesting roles to do with them. I got a chance to work with senior directors, even the CEO of the organization at that time. I was just 3 years in the industry. So you can imagine how exciting that would be, just to even get to work with such people and do interesting roles. Now, while at home, I was facing abuse of all sorts, and especially, more like something that is humiliating, which is taking away your confidence, which is undermining you. On the work front, it was just the opposite. It almost felt like as if I was living two lives at the same time. Work front, it was success, achievement, recognition, sense of fulfillment, there was purpose, and there were, of course, a lot of people who you really enjoyed and you connected with. So that was really the point where I started seeing that how are these two such diverse things existing in my own life at the same time? And that got me to question. 3 years later, I left my marriage. Fast forward 10 years, I did my PhD. While I was doing my doctoral degree, I actually ended up studying my own experience and through the lived experiences of other people. Now, before I get into more of the paradoxical nature of work, let's look at some of the basics. What is intimate partner violence? Often we use intimate partner violence and domestic violence in the same breath, and it is the use of power in the form of verbal, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse by one partner in an intimate relationship to control the other. What is important here is to note the intimate relationship. Now, intimate relationship can be a marriage, it can be a live-in relationship, it can even be dating. In fact, one of the statistics that's quite scary and alarming, it is from the US, where amongst the teenager, there is 40% increase of intimate partner violence while dating. And it starts as early as when they're 11 years old. So you can imagine how scary that scenario is. It doesn't spare anybody, whether it is different cultures, societies, ethnicities, socioeconomic strata, it impacts everybody. Oftentimes you feel that it is really limited to the lower economic strata, but that's not the reality. Some of the statistics, 1 in 3 women globally experience it in their lifetime. And this is more specific to physical and sexual violence. If you start looking at verbal and emotional and others, I'm sure the number is going to increase. In India, this number is even higher. There's 38% of murders of women that is actually by their current intimate partner or their previous intimate partner. While there are similarities across geographies and ethnicities or cultures, the causes of intimate partner violence or the interventions or the solutions, one cannot generalize, one cannot universalize because they're very specific to that context and that needs to be kept in mind. Moving on. So why did I choose middle-class women to look at for this particular research, or even my whole research agenda is focused on that? Apart from it being motivated by my own personal experience, what I also realized is that there is very limited research on middle-class women, often because the urgency of work is so high for the lower socioeconomic class that gets more focus, that gets more funding. Also because the privileges that the middle-class women have, which one thinks about it from the access of resources, that is education and money, that in itself makes them vulnerable. They may be educated, but not all middle-class women have access to money in the same way. They may not be controlling money. And so that ends up becoming more difficult for them. Apart from that, the social norms or values that are around middle class, it often leads women themselves who are experiencing intimate partner violence to deny its occurrence. Like I myself experienced when I was in a situation, my first reaction was, it can't happen to me. It doesn't happen to me. It happened to the lady who came to cook at my mother's place, but how can it happen to me? And so those stereotypes are so deeply ingrained in our psyche that it's very hard to get that out. The other one is also, which is very strong in middle class, is to protect the image of your male partners. You will really not want to talk with your family when one first couple of incidents happen, because you're like, oh my God, he will lose respect with my family. So I don't talk, or my friends will not like him if I tell them about it. So what do you do? Where do you go? Then there is, of course, I talked about self-blame, and there is a sense of personal failure that you get into, that there's something I might have done, or even if it was making decision to get married to this person, there was some role that I had to play, and hence this is where it is. Now, they don't, because of all of this and many other reasons, they're really not likely to report this. And if that happens, then it really keeps them invisible. So a lot of times you think that this family is perfect, everything looks great, but you really don't know what's happening behind the doors. So they are invisible in their trauma and in their pain. And that makes it even more difficult. In some of the studies that have been done, it shows that whenever there is somebody from this background, they go and look for support with shelters, they are denied access, often because they have limited budget, they have limited place, and they look for those for the people from lower socioeconomic strata. So they're like, okay, you have more resources, you can find other places to stay or other opportunities. However, it may not just be that they have actual resources, like I said earlier. Just because they are from middle class, that doesn't mean they have control on money. Second, they may need safety. Just being on their own out there may not be really what they need at that time. They may need a support from an emotional or a community perspective, and they may not get that from their family or other sources, and hence the need for really the shelter. So really from all of the perspectives from middle class and violence, it is not fair to say that just because they have economic empowerment, which in some cases may not happen, but even those who have it, that is not really sufficient, or it does not translate into social or psychological empowerment. We will see several narratives of different women and try and get into these aspects a little further. Moving on. In terms of really the work, apart from the context that I talked about from my personal experience, just connecting with what has happened over the last several decades in this area. Now, there is extensive research on how paid work provides economic independence, and there is no taking away that. It doesn't matter whether it is middle class or whether it is lower socioeconomic class. In fact, there was a very exhaustive study done several years ago about how having work or paid work before you get into an inter-partner violence can actually reduce the chances of violence, or it makes it easier for you to leave. So that again is a plus point. And I think with all the women that I have spoken to, whether they're in the United States or they're in India, almost everybody has said that just because I had work, I had financial security and I could make decisions. So that's, of course, intuitive. We can understand that. However, there is, dearth of research when we look at the positive spillover that work brings to personal lives. So there's a lot of research that says that, okay, if you are in an abusive situation, it could happen that you just came from an incident of abuse. You're not in a mental condition. Sometimes you're not even in a physical condition to go to work. So you will call in sick, or you will just give some other excuse. Even if you can go into work, you may not be able to perform at the best of your ability because you're upset. For those who have been in abusive relationships for a long period of time, it ends up into depression or some kind of chronic mental illness. And so that may affect your work. So there is work done on that area. But there are also positive spillovers. And what are these? And so that is the area that really got me very intrigued to study. Having done that kind of work first, I started looking at, okay, because there were stories from women who also talked about that work itself became abusive. So while they were finding some relief because they had job, there was almost like, it was exasperating their violence because work situation was also looking very unpleasant, even to the extent that there was sexual harassment or other kind of issues. And that is why I came to this argument that work, it is a paradoxical role. There are times that there is something good and there are times that it isn't. Moving on, like I said earlier, my work is about speaking with women. And Dr. Arjun and I was talking about this before I started the session, that it can be really hard sometimes. It can be very draining to keep looking at those transcripts, to keep hearing the stories, to keep working on this and wondering when will this end. However, it is absolutely a privilege that when you speak to these women, there have been times when they have told me that I'm probably the only one that they have shared this, or at least the details with. There are times when they have said that barring their family or their counselor, therapist, I'm the only other person who knows about it and nobody else knows about it. So the trust that they put in you is very high. And there is nothing that they're getting out of it, except that we know that when you engage in a process like this, you also get a chance to reflect or connect with somebody in a very non-judgmental way. However, what I have found is whenever I have talked about my own personal experience, which I always do before we start the research, I think that really becomes a very important point to build trust. And so we get into a very different space to co-construct knowledge and to understand what this is and where this will take us. What I'm going to do for my presentation is I'm going to present several narratives of women, different women across US, across India. I will give you a little background about the women so that you start understanding what is their context, what is their story. And then we will talk about 5 paradoxes that I see, and we will move on from there. The first one, so before I get into it, this is a narrative of a woman, Kathy. She was a public accountant working in a religious organization in the US, in New York City. And this is her narrative. She talks about, one day he came home drunk. I had dinner ready and he didn't want the spaghetti sauce, how it tasted. And he threw it at me and it was hot. And I had just poured it and it burnt me. And he went and got a shotgun, held at me. It was a loaded shotgun, actually. I just told him I was sorry and I will make him some new stuff and tried to be real calm, you know, and he backed off and he was. I could have been dead. And at that very point, I decided I am going to contact my friends back in the New York City at work and ask them for help. Today, I'm a grandmother of 4 and I'm alive only because of my work. So the people at work, they really geared up and they really supported her and they found all sorts of support in getting her out of that situation. There's lots to it. Next story is of Mridula. Mridula is from a large city in Bangalore, comes from an upper middle class family, but a very conservative family. She worked in medical transcription and for a short while, and later on she moved to becoming a teacher. She talks about her experiences, and it is largely with her family. So I was stripped and beaten up. My child was locked in a dark room. I had never experienced any pain like that before. I cannot even describe it. He had burnt me. But even after seeing the burn marks, no one believed me because my husband said it was an accident. They stole my jewelry and blamed me for having an extramarital affair. It was so bad, but no one believed me. They would hold panchayat and get me publicly shamed. My family did not support. My brothers forced me to go back to my husband. I had marks all over my body. I took pictures of my marks and sent to my family over email. I was so angry. I kept crying. My baby was crying, and her baby was only 6 months old at that time. I was going to the police, but my dad did not want me to go to the police station, and he told me, please do not go to the police. I know you are hurt. My brothers had stopped speaking to me because the social status is so important for them. They did not want me to end my marriage. I do not want to let go of my family. These are the people who were with me, and I want my son to have a family. So maybe one day things will be okay. I cannot change their thoughts. So you can see the complexity here that despite of the hurt, pain, betrayal, she still doesn't want to let go of the family because that's all that she knows of. And after leaving her abusive relationship, even more the significance of the family and why she wants to keep the family. So these are just 2 narratives to build some context. Moving on, the first paradox is safe space versus lack of safety at work. So like I said, a lot of people, a lot of women said that work is a safe space because home is not. So it's easily understandable. But here is a narrative of a woman who is actually a university professor in upstate New York. At the time of the incident, she was working in the corporate, and she talks about it, that how she was actually thrown out of her apartment at 4 a.m. in the morning by her partner. They were in a live-in relationship. And she says that there was no physical abuse, but the fact that she was left on the streets at 4 a.m. was in itself an abuse. And at that time, she couldn't think of any other place to go but to go to her office. And she said literally the brick structure and the concrete made her feel safe. It was an access control door. It was highly secure. And so she ran there. And she says that she stayed the whole night there, whatever the rest of the night that was there, till she could make arrangements. And even for the days to come, the workplace and the security and some of her colleagues really stayed together with her when her partner would come in to harass outside her work or would make calls to harass her at work. Let's look at another scenario. So in this case, you're seeing that it's a safe space. Nayana, who is actually a very senior leader in the corporate, she talks about it that in her early stages of her career, my boss came on to me. I said no to him. And then the head of HR department came on to me. He was the head of HR. When I said no, then the entire HR department ignored me because everyone had come on to me and I had said no. And no other colleague wanted to take panga with the HR head. Basically, nobody wanted to meddle with them. She even goes to the senior woman or manager in her organization for help. And that lady helped her in the way that she offered to go and talk to her boss. But guess what happened? It backfired. He became even more nasty, and it was even harder for her to live in that hostile environment. She says she was lucky that she got a job elsewhere and she left as soon as she could. But you can see how exasperating that can be. Moving on, the second paradox that I talk about is the support that one gets from work versus the isolation that you feel at work. And the two can happen. So if you look at the story here of Shanice was working in a large medical research organization in the US. And she talks about it that she realizes that somewhere her domestic violence situation was affecting work. So she reached out to what is called the Employee Assistance Program. A lot of corporates now have this department where they provide third-party services like counseling, legal support, or otherwise. In her case, and being in the US, she said she not only got counseling support, but she also got legal assistance. And everybody just advised her to leave him and to find basically safety. At one point, even her life was in danger. However, she also goes around to saying that she not only had friends from work that she keeps in touch with even after having left the work and moved on to other jobs, but she says that she found a sense of belonging in the workplace. They celebrated things, they grieved together, they went for funerals together. So it really became more like a sense of belonging for her rather than just a place of work. So that's how meaningful or significant a place of work can be for somebody who's going through an abusive home situation. You can see how contradictory it is, because all of this usually comes from your home, because you're getting this, you're supposed to get the sense of belonging from home, but it's not coming from home for these people. Kavita is actually a counselor in India, and she works with a lot of corporates where she provides counseling services to the women or the female employees in organizations. And she says that women have to go through a lot. It is not easy for them to reach where they reach. Long hours of work, a lot of sacrifices. So they do not want anyone to think less of them or doubt their capability. They do not want to be questioned. They are senior female leaders who are in abusive relationships and do not want to lose the sense of family they have. They want the ideal marriage, perfect family. They are also the same women who will speak about women's empowerment to other employees. Also, employees 100% assume that the organization will not support them with IPV. They do not trust the employer on this matter. There is lack of empathy. So you see the complexity that they are not only alone in the organization struggling and making a career for themselves, but they cannot even talk about their scenario. Instead, they are going and talking about women's empowerment to other employees. So it's isolation outside as well as within to themselves, that they cannot live in that authenticity with the truth that is their abusive home situation. Moving on, I think there's one more after this. The fourth paradox is about change in personality. So again, I talked about Nayana, who's a senior corporate leader. She talks about that how currently she is looked at as somebody who's a strong leader, a supportive leader, a good leader, and things like that. But she says that this is not who she was. When she was growing up, people could actually tell her to change her mind, and she wouldn't stand up for herself. She wasn't somebody who was very courageous. But because of the work and the responsibilities that she has had at work, over a period of 10-15 years, she's seen this big change in her personality, how she has evolved as this leader, a strong, supportive leader. And she reckons with that today. It's not just an exterior image that she has at work, but this is who she has become now. The same person talks about the other side of change in personality. And remember her case where she had her boss and the head of HR come on to her. So look at how that has impacted her life. She says, I went from someone being very open about my life to someone being very closed because I was afraid. I was being judged. And also with all the men making advances, I didn't talk about myself, my past. Definitely people assumed that I was divorced because, usually when you meet someone who's single and is reticent about her or his personal life, the assumption is that they have been married. So they don't ask those questions and they will leave you alone. The few people who asked, I said, I'm not comfortable, and they backed off. But I also stopped socializing with other people at work because it was actually in these office social events that she had men reach out, hit on her or make advances, which was really putting her in a bad situation. So she stopped socializing at work. Her whole social life changed. While she was a person who loved socializing, was very gregarious, very extrovert, it made her completely into somebody who's an introvert and who would only socialize with known people or people connected to her kids. So that's how it changed her. The last paradox I'm talking about is the space for reflection. The space for reflection is, like I talked about earlier in my case, that how work was making you realize that there is something different at the home front. So here there is Natasha, who's also a senior leader in the corporate in India. And she talks about that often she would make excuses to not go home. Rather, she would want to hang out with her friends. She would ask them, do you want to go for a movie? Do you want to go for a drink? While she has her kids and her husband waiting at home. And there was one day when she said, I sat in the car for almost 40 minutes, not starting the car. Why? Because I didn't have anywhere to go and I didn't want to go home. And she says that that is the moment I realized that I'm more myself at work. I'm more cheerful and happier and a happier person at work. And it was that moment that she decided that I am not going to not be a mother just because I don't want to see my husband at home. And so she doesn't want to go back home because of her husband. So she made a decision to move out. Similarly, there is another situation. We talked about Kathy earlier, who found that the work was so significant for her that it literally saved her life. But she also got into this scenario where she says that work was actually abusive for her. Remember, she was working in a religious organization in the United States. It's a large religious organization. She says that the biggest thing for me, I started to think about it when we were talking. That means when I was talking to her and we had the research interview. She says, I mentioned how similar my staying in the organization for years was staying with my abusive husband. It was a very similar experience, work experience. The schedule was not yours. You mustn't tell anyone if you don't want to be there. It was very abusive behavior. There was no physical abuse. If you need to get your work done, you need to stay up all night to do it. So I guess there was physical abuse. So she goes back on that. There was no beating, that didn't occur. Depriving you of food. You are bad, so you are going to eat rice and beans for 3 weeks. So things like that. So I would love to know why I have never really tried to figure out why I did that. And she worked for this company for 20 years. By the end of our conversation, she was actually talking about whether it is the obligation that she felt, because almost the beginning of her career is when they saved her from the abusive marriage, that she stayed this long and she dealt with this abuse as well. Okay, moving on. Okay, I missed one more. So really, this is the 5th one. I am not good at math, so that's what it shows. Anyway, so this is about negative impact on work versus women feeling a sense of accomplishment or literally flourishing at work. So Nancy, she worked at a not-for-profit organization that did work with women and children. And she talks about a situation where she got involved with the director of the organization. And that relationship turned into an abusive relationship. So in the beginning, she felt that it was great. He was a friend. They worked together. However, when it turned abusive, it became very challenging to draw boundaries at work. And eventually she had to leave the workplace. On the other hand, we look at Sumitra, who was an entrepreneur, but later on she became a school teacher. And she talks about how work plays a key role. It keeps me thinking. It keeps my brain working. I'm trying to think of new ideas because the kind of place I'm working at is not a stereotype school. So it keeps me and my brain very active, thinking. Children give me a lot of energy, even on the gloomiest of the day, gloomiest of the mood. The moment I walk into the class, I'm already fine, absolutely normal. And the last one, Florencia, she was a cardiac nurse doing very specialized work. And she talks about how work really was something more to her, where my self-esteem was just raised. She felt a lot of positives coming from work. She said, starting from feeling that I was saving lives to her patients really valuing the work that she did. So these are really the 5 paradoxes that I talk about. I would quickly go over some of the theoretical lens that I'm using to analyze this context and this area. The first one is vulnerability. What is vulnerability and who is considered vulnerable? One of the things that I started thinking about is that, do middle-class women in abusive relationships, are they considered vulnerable? That is the starting point. I still don't have an answer, but what also I found out is that there is a definition for ideal victim. An ideal victim, there are, I think, 4 criteria that is mentioned there, out of which 2 of them, the middle-class women who are in abusive relationship don't meet. Rather, any woman in abusive relationship usually doesn't meet. So for ideal victim, you need to, when you're being attacked, your abuser, you don't need to know that person. So it's an unknown abuser. But when you are in domestic violence or abusive relationship, you know your abuser. So that itself disqualifies you from being an ideal victim. And the other one is about you being able to cooperate with the police in giving all the details or incidents of the crime that happened. Oftentimes, like I said, especially middle-class women, they will not talk about it and they will not cooperate with the police. So if you're really not the ideal victim, then will people grieve for you? That's the question. The next one that I look at it is from the autonomy perspective. Now, a lot of times people ask this question that why do women continue staying in abusive relationships? Why don't they make a decision to move out? It's very easy to question them and probably in some way implicitly, make an assumption that they don't have the autonomy or they cannot. Well, it's not that straightforward because autonomy is, there are different kinds of autonomy and there's relational, there is personal, there's social, etc. I am looking at it from a relational autonomy perspective, which actually is formed because of your interactions, your interpersonal relationships with the other, and the social norms have a big role in helping you form that autonomy. So it is not that straightforward for you to say, okay, I will pick up and I will leave. The other thing also is in cultures where autonomy is really idealized and celebrated, it's easier to do that. But in cultures like India, it is not, because autonomy is almost a threat to the society. The last one that I have used in some of my research is empowerment. And this is not empowerment that you empower somebody else. Rather, it is for the person to become aware of their powerlessness and then become aware of power dynamics at work and look at building skills and capabilities, gaining control over their life and exercising that finally to uplift others. So you not just get empowered yourself, but you're really working even outside, externally. So that's really from a theoretical lens perspective. Some of the conclusions so far, and of course this is work in progress, there's definitely this internalized notion of social class and domestic violence that we spoke about. I also spoke about autonomy being complex. It is socially constructed, and it's not that easy to talk about why women don't have the autonomy or how can they become more autonomous. It's quite a complex process. It's a process as well as a state, both. Work, as we have seen, can be a fertile ground for several, and they've talked about safety, support, reflection, nurturing, etc., while it can be oppressive. And from an empowerment perspective, because middle-class women do not get a lot of attention in this area, there aren't planned interventions or programs that will help them to move out, to become empowered. So it happens in a very implicit way, and that too when they decide to embark on that journey and they become aware of it, and they have places for reflection, opportunities for reflection. Finally, the question, okay, so who has the moral responsibility in this scenario? Especially when I'm talking from a work perspective. In a lot of my discussions with HR managers at large organizations, they've often said that it's potentially a legal issue, it's a personal issue, we don't want to get involved. So the debate is out there. But if we look at the current scenario where everybody is working from home, I think it is not that easy for HR managers or for organizations to now continue saying the same thing, because now there's hardly any distinction between your work and your personal life. And if there is any untoward incident that happens while you're working from home during office hours, but now your home is your office, then who is responsible? So there are many other things that we can talk about. I have some content to talk about with respect to organizational responsibility, etc. But I think at this stage, I will just pause and open it up for discussion, and we'll take other things as we go along. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Arjun, could we invite now?
Anshula,
And
cannot hear you.
And then probably Anshula or Arjun, who is around, or Simi.
am I audible?
Yes, Anshula, go on.
Yes, so like I was just saying, thank you, Professor Kumar, for that very deep, very thought-provoking discussion, and a much needed one. And it was so powerful that you shared from your experience and your work. It really added another layer to this new lens that you've looked at IPV with through the lens of work and IPV, right? So, and I think to keep the discussion going, we would go to our discussants. So I would first like to invite Dr. Doris Gray. I just briefly introduce her. Dr. Doris Gray retired as a professor of women and gender studies and director of the Hillary Clinton Center for Women's Empowerment at Akhawayn University, Morocco. She is an author and a public speaker, and before becoming an academic, she also worked as a journalist and foreign correspondent in South Africa, and then for almost 10 years in Kenya. Dr. Gray, over to you.
Okay, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Well, Smita, thank you for this really gripping talk. You have a phenomenal ability to weave the very, very painful personal with the objective professional. So I truly appreciate that. As I came on board of this event fairly recently, my thoughts are a little jumbled, but I wrote down some things that I would like to maybe throw into the discussion. What I found fascinating in Smita's talk was when you're talking about middle-class women, it seems almost there is a universal middle-class culture that transcends global North, global South, Europe, the US, India. Middle-class women seem to have quite a few traits in common that are wonderful and disturbing at the same time. And you pointed out this paradox. When we talk about middle-class women, we think of women who are confident, who make reasoned decisions, who know how to make choices, who know how to deal with their own problems. So we do not think of them as victims or potential victims. And that in itself then becomes a problem. Their success, the flip side of their success, is that they're what you termed not grievable or not being perceived as vulnerable. And with that, because we associate success with middle-class women, the threshold of shame or feeling shame about something bad happening to them is so much higher. So they fall from so much higher than, let's say, lower class women, where they're not expected to have all these wonderful traits associated with them. Mm-hmm. And so admitting to being a victim is so much more difficult. Plus, if you're talking about middle class or upper middle class women, going to the policeman is probably of a lower social standing, has less education than you, the victim. So again, he or she, the police officer, will not look at you as a grievable person, a person deserving to be grieved over. So these are some issues that I thought could be looked at. What we need then is sort of a paradigm shift in looking at middle-class women, that success, ability, independence, all do not correlate with, therefore you cannot be a victim. You can have all of those traits and at the same time be a victim. Absolutely. The other thing I found interesting in your talk was that many of the people you interviewed seemed to seek out work colleagues or friends as confidants, or even you, the researcher. So I found it very troubling that they did not go to their families, their parents or siblings, meaning to me that seemed to indicate that the problem already is in the original family or the originating family. Yes. Or else they would turn to the family of origin for help. Mm-hmm. The fact that they're turning to outsiders, work colleagues, friends, researchers, seems to indicate that something is already not working well in the family from which they came. Yep. So that brings me to Professor Kalka's comment about redefining the nature of the family or democratic institutions in the family. What is wrong in the family that produces women who are really successful, but when they become victims, cannot turn to their families? That is a real problem, I think. And then just one small comment I want you to make. When you listed the forms of violence, you spoke of psychological, sexual, physical, and emotional. And I would really add, and you mentioned it later on, but I would add it to your list, the economic violence. Yeah. The deprivation of financial resources, which again is something that one does not associate with a middle-class woman. You think she has access to resources when in fact she may be making a lot of money, but not having access to her own resources. And then another point you started to raise at the end, which I find absolutely really critical, is about moral or ethical responsibility of the employer. Now that a lot of people, women, are required to work in home office. It's not a personal choice that they work in home office, but they're required to work from home. What is the responsibility of the employer with regards to intimate partner violence? Is then the intimate partner violence occurring in the workspace, since your home is now your office? And therefore, is there a responsibility of the employer to intervene? Is it a private matter when the violence happens in the private space, which is now also the workspace? So I think there are quite some pertinent ethical and legal dilemmas. And I just talked, since you was talking about something personal, I was talking with my daughter, who is a leader of a very large team. And she was just telling me the same thing. Mom, I have these employees sitting in front of their screen and I know something is going on at home. Can I articulate that, or am I invading their private sphere. I can see it on the screen that something is going on. And she said, where can I turn to? Where are the universal ethical guidelines for this new situation, or even legal guidelines? So I think, Smita, you are onto something that is so important right now. And with that, I think I want to end my comments.
Thank you so much, Doris. Really, really valuable insight. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Doris.
Very
Great.
important.
Further kind of adding to the what Dr. Kumar has pointed out. Can we go to the
Yes.
second one before we request Professor Kumar to address some issues?
Yes,
Can
ma'am.
we go to Professor?
So our next discussant is Dr. Nandani Mudali. She is an author, independent researcher, and a gender and communication professional, among other engagements in her diverse portfolio. Her areas of professional interest include gender-based violence, masculinities, LGBTQIA issues, mental health, and trauma literacy and education. She is the director of Speak, an initiative of the MS Chalamuthu Trust and Research Foundation, Madurai, set up to change conversations on suicide and promote mental health. Over to you, Dr. Murli.
Thank you, Anshula. First of all, thank you, Dr. Kumar, for a very profound, engaging, and compelling presentation. The fact that you anchored your work in the space of lived experience and used a lived experience narrative to sort of look at this very complex and complicated issue made it very, very compelling for me. And I sort of resonated so much with what you said, because so much of the insights that you offered are also applicable to the work I do. So some of the important threads which I picked up from your presentation is the victim shaming and blaming, and the 4S, the stigma, shame, secrecy, and silence, which prevents victims from actually voicing the abuse. And therefore, for me, what emerged was the need to normalize conversations on IPV. Currently, it is enmeshed in secrecy and silence. So how do we normalize conversations? You know, there is no conversations. And I just sense the kind of oppression, because how do I define oppression? Oppression for me is the absence of dialogue. And there is a conspicuous absence of dialogue or conversations, not even conversations, let alone dialogue in this area. And I particularly one second, just a second. Sorry. I'm so sorry, it's my dog which is that. One second. Ishwari.
Ma'am, please go on, no worries.
No problem.
It's just that Minil gets கொஞ்சம் ஒரு மாதிரி மூடி வச்சிடுங்க, பாதி மூடி வச்சிடுங்க கதவை, அங்க இருங்க நீங்க. Sorry.
No problem.
Not a problem.
Not at all problem.
Ma'am, you got muted.
I think you got muted, Dr. Mudali.
I loved the dichotomy you raised about the personal and professional spaces, the domestic and the public spheres. And it reminded me of, you know, one of those still relevant slogans of the feminist movement: the personal is professional. So right now, I think there is a complete absence of, there's a complete disengagement in this regard, and the diverse realities you spoke about. And then, of course, as I was listening to you, what struck me was IPV is a great leveler. It cuts across class and caste barriers. And I also loved what you said, referencing your own lived experience with IPV, that it can't happen to me. It couldn't be happening to me. It could happen only with others. So what that struck me, that this otherization, you know, that is something we really need to be looking at. And the victim blaming and shaming, which is very prevalent in such contexts, and the exaggerated sense of responsibility for what is happening, which victims experience. It's almost like I feel they are hyper responsible, that they hold themselves hyper responsible for what is happening, and and the invisibilization of the whole experience. You want to protect the other, when actually at the cost of even endangering yourself. And this whole invisibilization of the trauma and pain narrative, which for me was extremely disturbing, and the disempowerment inherent in the whole process. And when you talked about paid work, women experiencing IPV and in the workspace, I also found the double bind very, very interesting. Home is not safe, and for many of these women, neither was the workspace. So the double bind was very, very interesting. And as I was listening to you, some of the other things which I just felt I would love to have your views was, obviously, IPV is an extremely complex and complicated issue. There are no easy, quick fixes or formulaic solutions. And if we really need to have, right now, I think discussion about IPV is still happening on the margins. So if we need to move it from the margin towards the center, obviously we need a convergence of several stakeholders. And one of the main stakeholders, I think, in the whole process is our mental health professionals, law enforcement, judiciary, families, of course, even the media, I would say, because sensitive reporting on these issues. And given that the whole thing is mired in insensitivity, so how do we gender this discourse? There needs to be a gendering of the whole IPV discourse. Currently, I find so much of it is gender blind. And the other thing is, what came up to me is that apart from the need for gendered perspectives to address IPV, when you were talking about the pain victims experience, their grief, their pain, the turmoil which they undergo, to me, it seemed so disenfranchised. It's almost they have been robbed of their right to grieve, their right to even voice their pain. So how do we enfranchise the disenfranchisement, which I think is so central to their journey of moving from the victim to a survivor, and then perhaps a thriver? So how do we help in this enfranchisement process? It's how do we give them, how do we help them to reclaim their right to grieve, their right to stand up and say that this is happening to me and I want to be heard and understood on my own terms? And how do we help them reclaim their narrative, their right, their need to tell their own stories? And this whole thing of, I loved what you said about some of the women being able to create a sangha, a supportive sangha. And, I think women in such disenfranchised situations need to have that tribe around them where they can, collectively grieve. And actually that grieving is so important, because I think what's happened is extremely traumatic, and they need to be able to own that pain. They need to be able to honor and witness that pain. And this is not only an individual process, it's as much a collective process. And how do we enable those supportive spaces, that tribe around these women? And it was very interesting. I think Dr. Gray also mentioned it, that much of the support for these women didn't come from their families. families, either their families of origin or their birth families. So for me, this also brings up this issue of the construct of a family. What is a family? Is it just based on kinship, or is it based on non-kinship as well? And I loved what you also said about autonomy. I would also link it to agency, because I think this agency has been completely snatched away, robbed from these victims. So for me, it's all about reclaiming one's agency, one's autonomy, and yes, it's also about owning a vulnerability. And I don't see vulnerability merely in the as powerlessness, but I think vulnerability is also a source of strength. Thank you for this very beautiful presentation, Dr. Kumar, because it seemed to resonate so much with my own personal journey and the kind of work I do. You give me so much hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anshula, do I respond now or?
Ma'am, we have one more discussant. Thank you, Dr. Murli. Our next discussant is Dr. B. Rajeshwari. She is an assistant professor of political science at GD Goenka University.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Kumar. I think I really enjoyed your talk, and I must compliment you for doing such an excellent work. I think the other two discussants have almost said a lot of things. One of the things that really struck me was in the beginning what you spoke about trust, and you said that when you were speaking to these people and there was this level of trust that was created. I just wanted to say that I felt something very similar when I did my own research. And I think this whole trust that comes in, that bond that we establish with our with people whom we talk during the time of our research is something which is very special. And this is something that even I felt. And I was just wondering that when you were doing your research and you were still you're continuing in this process, you were involved in it. And I think all of us, do get involved with this kind of process for a long period of time. So did you also feel burdened to some extent? Because that is something that I sort of, I would say, struggled with it to some extent. I sometimes used to feel burdened that they have so much of trust on me, and I should be able to carry forward their narratives in a proper manner, in a way that, so as a researcher, how do we engage in this process? I also had these struggles. So that's why I thought this could be maybe a forum to exchange, how can we do this and in the correct way. So that was one of the things that struck me. And the other thing was what Dr. Murli was really talking about. And this is a question that I always got, because I also worked on autonomy, and I was working and with this idea of narrative autonomy, what you also speak about relational autonomy. I think to a large extent I found them quite similar. So I always got this question that why not agency and why autonomy? So I'm wondering that, do you also get this question a lot, why not agency and why are we using this word autonomy and why don't we group them? But I always felt when I was talking to the to women who were working, my work was also quite similar. Of course, it was not about violence per se. I was working with women who were working in panchayats, but a lot of it was also about violence because they shared these stories with me. And but I always felt that this whole thing of agency was something which was not so easy. At least to use such a word like agency, I always felt that there is something. It was much more closer, I would say, to autonomy than agency, because agency is a much more, I would say, powerful word, and they kept going back and forth on it. So I was not able to very comfortably use this word. I was wondering whether you also felt something like that. So those are my questions. Really, I don't think it's really comments, but these were the questions that were coming to my mind because I could relate a lot of it to the work that I did. So which is why. Thank you so much for this wonderful sharing this whole thing.
Thank you.
Dr. Rajeshwari. Before Professor Kumar responds to all these comments, if our chair, Professor Kelkar, would like to come in briefly for her comments. Ma'am.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. It is perfect example of co-constructing knowledge with women and their narratives, and how really their words can be analyzed, and how what can be gained and what can be learned.
Govind, ma'am, your video.
Oh, okay. So discussants have been very powerful also, as powerful probably as you have been. So that would be the, but I wanted to put really some kind of thinking, because I've been thinking, like I said earlier, how to end the violence against this kind of pervasive violence, all violence. Why we think that women are vulnerable, why we think that women are non-autonomous, non-agent, full with non-agency. So, and I work with a lot with the rural women. I come also from a rural area. So what I think that why women feel frozen and unable to do much in this situation when they face the violence, that is one. Whether middle class or non-middle class, to me it comes that I accept, I fully agree with you that there are no quick fixes or solutions to this question, as all of us have pointed out. But I think what thing that matrilineal, a study of matrilineal systems in India and China has really shown me that if women have the land and house in their names, they are there, they are no longer vulnerable. There may be some cases of violence, but not physical violence. Men shout, and even in a state like Haryana, which is known for wife beating, women, when they got this kind of Hindu Succession Amendment Act, and women said that, look, I will go out if you raise your hands, and I will go out with a piece of my land, with my share of the land. And after that, these women report, this research has come out, that men, they may shout, they said, standing in a corner, but they would not beat women. So physical violence is stopped. I mean, domination, definitely there was a dent in the forms of domination. So we have to see that I don't accept change of heart without really material platform. Material platform kind of comes only with something kind of working. And when you are living and sleeping with the person who controls all your resources, it is a very fatiguing kind of thing, that every time you are asking for your right, and then you start giving in, and then the process continues. So that is the process of vulnerability can be looked from the other end. At the same time, it can be looked at that how it is generated or strengthened, not generated, how it is strengthening, how in the process it gets strengthened. My second point was also, where do women go if there is a violence? I don't believe in shelters, because shelters are very temporary. They are not very willing kind of things. They are kind of putting shame on women that she has run away and this and that. But parental home, can they go to parental home? The most opposition they face from the young men, the brothers, that who think that now she has come to claim her rights to land and house and be a kind of additional burden. This is what the research has shown, kind of ICIW and others, and my own research also. So that is, if they have land and house, then probably they can claim that kind of thing. Why the Hindu Succession Amendment Act has been made and why it has not been passed, but not implemented. I mean, like other laws. So this is the second question that I wanted to raise, that certainly organizations will need to be made responsible for this, but state and the family and community need to be made more responsible. Some of us are kind of think community is a homogeneous community. I mean, there are no layers, but like household, community is also kind of has many dark spots. It is also a kind of black box in which we think men and women are like this. So if you consult a man, the women's voice is automatically included, and this is not there. Third point I wanted to make about financial, social, and economic control with men. That continues in the household, that continues outside the household. and 33% representation, which is not adequate at all, that also has not been achieved. So women are seriously underrepresented in any kind of decision making, even in matrilineal societies. I mean, first thing that compared to other states of India, patriarchal states, violence against women, but intimate partner violence against women in Meghalaya was almost nil kind of thing, if you look at the relation situation. And that was only because of one factor: land and lineage is with women. These are two things are with women. So this head of the household concept, now it is being questioned a bit in World Bank and other bodies, but it has never been questioned in the traditional system. Even China, which did not have traditionally the head of the household system, introduced soon after the reform. Now also we have the head of the household. So how the modernity, the laws and the social norms, they really introduce the economic independence and economic dependence of women, and which results into the strengthening the emotional dependence on women. You please one master and then you can live with whatever the dignity is possible. You be Mrs. So and so. Your whole identity changes, your name changes, your style changes, you have to adapt to the family or you go somewhere. These are the very much middle class women working in banks and call centers and IT centers. They talk about this kind of thing, that is the adjust or please one master and then you are free. Of course they want to work because there they can express their agency and autonomy. My last point is also that I think kind of things we need to about is that not autonomy, but we need agency, freedom, and independence of women. That is what we need. That is you cannot be autonomous in a situation like home where your every breath is controlled by someone else. It is and supported by social cultural norms. So it has to be, I'm not talking of the dismantling of the family, but what I'm talking about the restructuring of the family. Otherwise the divorce rate, which has gone everywhere, and it is growing up in this kind of new generation also, because the family has become so oppressive and women don't have any economic, financial, and cultural, social rights. So I think we should not feel shy of projecting a model where complete independence of women is needed, because otherwise family is such a stronghold that it is so difficult to change. Social norms need to be changed, they need to be addressed. That is what my take is from lecture and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really very, very powerful. Thank you, Dr. Doris Gray. Thank you, Dr. Murli. Thank you, Dr. Rajeshwari and Dr. Kelkar. I think there's so much that we can probably spend another couple of hours discussing this, but let me try and see what are the key points in each of these perspectives that you so beautifully shared, and address those, and then we'll see where this goes. I think I'll begin with Dr. Doris Gray. I think she talked about this universal middle class. Absolutely, there is that parallel that you see, whether it is somebody from America that I'm speaking with or somebody from India. You almost feel like you change the names and the story is very similar. There isn't really a lot of difference there. So that is common. However, we also see that the whole middle class cultural norms, social norms that may look a little different, but there is similarity. And what is more significant is the pressure to fit in that middle class. I think that is similar and very, very powerful and very overbearing, almost to the extent that they feel it's like a, it's like a wall that they cannot move beyond or they cannot push. I think the other thing that I am picking up from your conversation was really the notion of paradigm shift, and trying and understand that even if you have success, you have achievement, you have education, all of that with you, there is this experience that you're having. Not saying that you are a victim, not saying that you're less than, but you are experiencing it and you are going through a trauma. And it is, the two are existing together at the same time. right? So yes, we need to start looking at that differently. The next point, which I also see common with Dr. Kelkar's point, is about family. Yes, it is absolutely problematic that women do not go to their family, whether I saw it in the women, their narratives in the US, or it was in India, the story was same. They felt that either it was the fear of being judged and not supported, or in Indian context, it was so disturbing, as you saw in Mridula's narrative, where she says that her father herself said that, no, you don't go to the police, the brothers stopped talking, they will disown her. So this fear of being ostracized is so high that you really do not want to take that on. That is even more debilitating than your abuse that you're going through with your husband or your partner. So that complicates the whole scenario a lot, which is why they end up going to other sources of support. I also am connecting with Dr. Kelkar's point about the ownership of land. I totally feel that. And I think I have seen some examples, though none in my research so far, that when that is there, their status and the way they make their decisions is taken in differently. So if you have that control in your family, you are valued very differently, even if it means changing norms. So people do not question you. I absolutely connect with that. And I agree that that is probably one of the big areas to explore to look at this change. However, one has to really, again, think about that, how easy or difficult that will be to get it done if you talk about from a legal standpoint, right? I think I'm moving on to Dr. Murli's points and that she raised, which were really quite exhaustive and amazing. I am looking at this point around where she's talking about this exaggerated sense of responsibility, and you become invisible. That responsibility that you have alone to make the marriage work, to make this situation, sustain. It is not a question that, okay, you leave, because then all the blame comes onto you that you broke the family. You went against the norms and the tradition. And so that is really disturbing, absolutely. And there is a double bind when you have abuse at home and you have abuse at work. Where do you go? What do you do in that scenario? You're caught. And when you're caught, it's not a question that I can't make decision, because it is more like a scenario that you are in where you are unable to figure out the next step. What is my next step and how do I take it? Where do I go? So if there is at least one thing that is working for you, that becomes a positive, that then in turn is seen that where it will go to that point where you will start connecting with a sense of self and your agency. You start developing what is called capabilities, which will then strengthen your agency for you to make decisions, for you to feel free and feel independent. So there is a process that happens which unfolds when there are these access to resources, whether they are material resources or whether they are more innate, or you're talking about more intangible stuff. Coming on to Dr. Rajeshwari, absolutely, I think this kind of work is very heavy. It can lead to any researcher feeling that sense that, okay, I have the burden of their narratives. What do I do with this? Or just the trust. And I think in my experience as well, I have always tried to draw on my own spirituality and the work that I do on the other space to really try and feel that I am being fair, I'm being just, because they are trusting me with their stories. And then there is this scholar who talks about that when you participate in this kind of research or work, you're actually walking with them in their past, which was very isolating and lonely. And so now that you have exchanged that space, in their past, they are no more alone. In fact, I still remember when there was this lady, the grandmother story that I talked about. She was more than 65, American. We sat together and she talked about it. And there was a moment where we both exchanged stories from our lives, where she said, wow, in 40 years, this is the first time I'm hearing another person talk about something that I experienced. And I thought I was alone in that experience. And today I don't feel alone. And she held my hand and we both just cried. Just in that research interview, we both cried. And I still get goosebumps when I think about that experience, that how is it that just in one moment, there is no loneliness, there is lack of isolation? So there is a huge responsibility, which is why I think it is important for us to be cognizant of that. And and this work actually led me to do my other research, which is researcher self-care. Because when you work with emotionally sensitive areas, it is bound to affect you. It is likely that you may internalize. And so how do you take care of yourself that you are really not reaching a point where you burn out? But it's also very important to realize that there is a line, that you cannot be their counselor, you cannot be their therapist. One of the researchers got so friendly with me that she wanted to keep meeting me after the research interview for coffees and discussions. A couple of times it was great, but then there was a time when I started feeling that she was almost thinking that I was a therapist, and I have to then point the resources to her so that she can get the right help. Because even if I'm qualified as a therapist, I can't play the role of a researcher and a therapist. That's not our relationship. So I have to help her find the right person. Then I am moving on to Dr. Kelkar's points that she raised. I think several of those I connect with the point that you're talking about, which I said about agency, freedom, independence, or the legal rights in terms of land ownership, etc. But let's go to the point where you talked about how do we end violence and where do we go from here? Where honestly, it requires everybody. It cannot be one or the other. While one of the things that I did talk about is the responsibility of the organizations, because organizations have just stayed away from it. And it is almost like an invitation to get them involved. There was a very powerful study that was done in South Africa, I think it was 2008, 2010, which was about, and it was a special program of empowerment for women and through their work. But what they saw is that in the first year of the program, there were a lot of women who were given that option to take employment and job, and mostly it was small scale industries and their own businesses. However, they saw that in the short span of time, as they were getting more and more money, access to money, and they were trying to exert their power to make decisions, the domestic violence actually increased. And there's a similar study done in Bangladesh as well, where they saw domestic violence increase. So in patriarchal societies, when women suddenly get more power, where they want to make decisions, where they were not allowed to make decisions, there can be an increase in domestic violence. However, what they saw is that after a year, when they saw that this was happening, they started involving the whole community, the families, the spouse, other people who were engaged in that. And they started working on awareness, on trying to understand what is it and how this whole thing works together. Then they saw that the domestic violence was going down. So really involving every group. And I think one of you probably talked about it, that it's not just we are talking about legal system, social system, families, because even for families, it's not hard, especially in cultures where you think about the family honor. It is shame that your daughter is now divorced and she's coming home. Or even if it is she's not coming home to claim any property, she's just divorced, and that itself is shame, period. How do you change the narrative? How do you start saying that, no, there is no shame? If it is not working, if there is abuse and there is no solution out of it, it is fine. So I think, again, with Dr. Kelkar's point, that we need to look at these social norms that need to be rewritten. And that's probably what I can share at this point in time. But like I said, it's exhaustive and we can go on for a while. So I'm going to pause right now.
Thank you, Professor Kumar, for your response. If it's okay, we will take a question or two from the Q&A box, and then we can go for another round of brief comments from the discussants.
Sure.
Okay. So we have one question from Nada El Maliki. She says, in your studies, Dr. Kumar, were there times where co-workers were a support system through getting involved and helping the victim of abuse in very dangerous situations, example, in need of escape? And a second question is from Radhika Ramani. The point of Dr. Kumar made on organizational responsibility is extremely pertinent and important. What are the basic things organizations need to do to help women in abusive relationships?
Interesting. So I didn't quite follow Nada's question. I will also go back and look at it, but I will start with Radhika Ramani's question. I think there are several things that organizations can do. And like I said, with my latest research on COVID and abuse, I have been speaking with a lot of HR directors. And interestingly, there is a lot of awareness about mental health. So people are doing a lot of talk session and trying to give them access to counseling services and otherwise. However, most of them are reluctant to engage in partner violence, except for one organization, and I cannot name them, but it's a large multinational global company and has a huge presence in India. They talked about it that not only in India, but in different parts of the world, they have what you called Women's Forum, that is one. And the culture that the organization has is a very high trust culture, where employees, when asked that, hey, are you experiencing abuse? There are employees who will go and connect with the HR people and say, yes, I am one of them. Or if they ask them, have you experienced abuse in the past? They will come up and say, yes, I have. Now, having worked myself in the corporate sector or now in academia, I don't see it happening in the organizations that I have worked. I don't see I going, at least in the past, that I would go and say, hey, I am in abuse and please help, or can we do something? Now I will talk about it because it's a different discourse, totally, right? So I think what is important for organizations is to look at this culture, which is so focused on trust, that they can actually come forth and talk about it. And I know it's not easy to build that kind of culture, but at least in the interim, to have these allied services through employee assistance programs, whether it is counseling, whether it is legal, whether it is social support, whatever the access that they can give to their employees, I think that's very important. I think what I'm drawing upon Dr. Murali's comment is really having these discourse more and more, because when we talk about it, then people will feel that, yes, I'm not alone. It is not just happening to me. There are others too, and there is a way out. We can find a solution. In fact, there is an example of the same organization. What they did is during COVID, they ran series of workshops with supervisors and managers to help them understand what is abuse and how to kind of make note of that when you know that you're working with a team and people in your team. Like what Dr. Doris Gray said, that her daughter is working and she knows that the team member is going through abuse. So they help them understand that. They help them deconstruct that. They also teach empathy so that they can understand that if an employee comes to you, then how do you engage in a conversation with them? Don't try to be dismissive. Don't try to give them advice. Don't try to solve their problem, but try and find out what is it that you can do best in that situation to lead them to the right resources. So those are some of the things that I can think of. Let me just go back to Nada's question so that I know exactly what she's trying to say. She's asking if the workers were involved in helping the victim of abuse to escape.
I think in the actual act of escaping, probably. Is that...
Yes, it was. And I think she came from that story that I talked about, Kathy, where she had a gun held to her and she actually found, yes, so they helped her get out. Yes. I can't hear you.
Audible now? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes. Okay, great. Yes, we can go to our discussants for a minute or two to give some more of their comments. Dr. Doris Gray, if you would like to come in.
There is so much there. It's really hard to pick what I think is most important. But one point that came out in quite a few of the discussants, in this paradigm shift, how do we get victims out of feeling shame? Because one, I think, of the main issues in even admitting to it, seeking help, is that people feel ashamed when something bad is happening to you. When you stumble in the street and break your leg, you are happy to talk, you know, I fell in the street and I broke my leg and ha, 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 look at this and how. You have no shame. But when it comes to sexual or intimate partner violence, immediately the barrier of shame is so huge And to have that paradigm shift to say, somebody said, and I wrote it down, being vulnerable and being successful at the same time is not the same thing. And that vulnerable is not powerless. When you're vulnerable, it doesn't mean you're powerless.
Mhm.
Actually, there is power in your vulnerability. You can own that. And to make sure that it's understood that when you're a victim, really the blame is not on you. You don't have to be ashamed. The blame is on the person who victimizes you. And that goes across cultures, goes across religion, goes across social class. For some reason, we internalize that shame, or victims internalize that shame. And very little change, I think, can happen until there is, and some of you also talked about that, to get out of this loop of assigning shame and feeling individual responsibility if something bad is happening to you.
Mhm.
That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gray. Dr. Nandani Mudali, would you like to come in?
I resonate a lot with what Dr. Gray has just spoken. I think the best antidote for shame is conversations, informed conversations, conversations anchored in very, very nuanced, sensitive perspectives. Because I think shame is like a mold that festers and grows in darkness. And when it is exposed to the light of knowledge, it just doesn't grow. And the other thing I'd also like to bring up here, which again is tied with shame, is that we need to enfranchise the whole process. You know, right now this is such a gross disenfranchisement. My rights to even grieve, to feel, to grieve the what I've gone through has been completely robbed from me. It's, so this whole process of enfranchisement needs to happen, because I think only then can true healing, and then perhaps which will lead to transform through tragedy. And in mental health discourse, we also now talk about not just post-traumatic stress, but how trauma itself can be very, very transformative. So how do we take the narrative to that space where it is no longer pathologized, medicalized, but it's truly viewed from a very, very empowering perspective. Right now, it's the disempowerment that is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Dr. Rajeshwari. Thank you, Dr. Mudali.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar, for answering that question on burden. And it was really very good. I mean, it was very helpful. I just wanted to say that I've also found, at least for my own research, that when women talk about these issues, it's also a very self-reflective process for them. Because as you rightly pointed out, they, for many years, maybe have not even spoken about these issues. And there's actually nobody to speak to. There is no one that they can really go to. So when they start having these conversations, then they also start reflecting back on what happened, and then they also start thinking that, I think you also point this out in your work, and you said that, they go back and they think that, okay, was it like this, or was it something different? So it's also a very self-reflective journey for them. And I also found, at least, that it's not only self-reflecting for the organization that I looked at was, they were facilitators, and there were also women who were getting a particular kind of training. So for both of them, it was a self-reflecting process, because both of them were together, and relationship and the bond that comes, especially women to women, that was something which was very special. So I think what you are rightly pointing out is that more and more such kind of conversations need to come out, so that there is a forum where they can at least express freely without anybody watching them, because it's also this whole thing that, somebody is watching, somebody is listening. What is that space in which they are able to share this? That space also becomes very important, because I think that in every kind of space they are not very comfortable. So that comfort of that space also sort of plays a very big role in what is it that they are sharing and how much they are willing therefore to talk. So that's something that I really thought was very important. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajeshwari. Professor Kumar, we have a few comments on our Facebook Live as well. Ila Joshi saying that I think middle class is mostly burdened by the concept of shame or saving one's face. Middle class symbolizes the aspirations both in terms of financial status and values at the same time. And probably that is what makes it difficult for middle class women to break the set limits of their society. And we also have Dr. Sydney Freeman Jr., who is commenting on one of the questions that was asked, saying that it's a great question. And when abuse happens on the job as while working at home, the question then really becomes what is now the responsibility of the organization. And we also have for one more question, Sunidhi. She is a researcher at IMPRI and she's joining us from Jamshedpur.
Yeah, so hello everyone. I'm a researcher at IMPRI, joining from Jamshedpur, Jharkhand. First of all, I would like to say thank you, ma'am, for talking on such a pertinent topic, and it is much needed. So, ma'am, my question is like how different the policies implemented by different countries has been, and what has been its impact. While while considering international and regional differences, how can the administration improve regarding this?
Very interesting. So first, I think just to qualify, I think my area is not policy, so I may not be able to give you an answer that will be completely well researched. But based on my work and the interface that I've seen with that, I think there is always this tussle that is happening is how much attention, money, resources need to be spent on issues of domestic violence. It is almost like every time the government changes, everybody has to relook at that all over again. It doesn't matter whether it is India, it doesn't matter whether it is US or any other geography. So I think that is very problematic, that just with the change in the government or the administrators, you are re-examining this, which is why sometimes it is absolutely frustrating that no matter where we are, for several years, this issue has been going on of domestic violence. And we've come to that point where we keep saying that, hey, when will this end? We're not able to get there, but the government policies will change. You will remove the money allocated to these programs, initiatives, whether they are advocacy, whether they are actual work where they will program implementation or execution or shelter or whatever that may be. So I think that is really one of the bigger things that I see as a problem. Some of the things that different countries or governments have been doing has been very interesting. I think there is very interesting work being done in either New Zealand or Australia that I came across, or even for that matter in some parts of the US, where they are, like I was saying, they are involving communities, they are involving all stakeholders. And so there is a lot of work in that area. Even with, I don't want to give a wrong name, but in one of the Latin American countries, they do a lot of work with men, where they start redefining what is masculinity, what is being a father. So parenthood, but specifically father. And so they did a lot, it's called Men Care program, and that they actually have stories and narratives of men who were first abusers and perpetrators of violence, and now they have decided, after hearing stories from their own children, that how them being abuser was having an impact on their child. And when they heard that story, or the child was scared to come and hug the father because the child saw the father beating up the mother, and the mother was crying. And so the distance between the father and child made the person go through a transformation where now the person has actually become a champion and talks about healthy parenthood, of being a father and what he missed out. So I think when we look at programs of that kind, they are really transformative because they're coming from, again, experiences that they have had.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. And I think now we can go to Professor Kelkar and then back to you, Professor Kumar, for your concluding comments as we try to work out a way forward in the ideal would be ending domestic and intimate partner violence, but until then, enabling more women to leave abusive relationships and families. Professor Kelkar, over to you.
I have said enough, and I think I just wanted to add few things and not really summing up because Anshula, you will do a very good job in summing up, or Arjun. I wanted to really ask this question to myself and to other middle class women. What is there for women in the family? Hmm? It is deprivation, it is discrimination, and it is resourcelessness. And I think that need to be addressed. Policy has been addressing. It is not that they have not addressed, but we need to have the effective policies and its implementation. That is there is a responsibility on the organization and the community, admittedly. I mean, there is no doubt about it. But the market and the state in particular are also responsible because these are the four institutions, these are the multi-pronged attack on women, whether they are middle class or they are working class, that is needed to be there. There have been laws passed. There have been Hindu Succession Amendment Act, there have been the Anti-Domestic Violence Act, but these act, why they have not been? India has a very progressive law on 2005 when they talked about the domestic violence or intimate partner violence act in 2005, but nothing much has been done in terms of keeping the women safe or implementing the law. So probably we need to nudge, and we need to a more kind of aggressive nudge, if I can say. That is important. That would be the this thing. Second is that maybe collectivity is a very important thing of women. I am not so sure that now middle class women are keeping mm, are silent about this or quite kind of thing. Now, how many young women and not so young women are reporting about the rape cases, gang rape cases, their parents are reporting. This itself is indicator that this whole idea of sense of shame is gone, and they do work out and they do raise the voice against this. And this kind of discourse as we are having today, more discourses are needed without any kind of with the kind of various kind of discussions. So as we did today, so that is very important. I learned in Bangladesh one thing: the self, like they have the credit and saving societies, and like our self-help group, and both in self-help groups and all the in these credit saving and credit societies in Bangladesh, women say this is our new family. They share the violence against women, they share the parental and the husband's home in particular, how they are kind of discriminated when they are kind of beaten up and all this kind of thing. So if we need trust building, which definitely we need, we can go through these women's organizations. That would be important. Communities and also the men who are engaging in against violence of women, that having some kind of linkages with them is also important, because it's a really the privileged group which has taken the responsibility, although it is very tiny minority, but you find in the countries, and that need to be appreciated. So I was thinking these are the few take homes kind of ideas that I am sharing with you. Still the question comes is hovering in my mind: how do we end this violence against women within home, in workplace, and in public and in streets? So the home, either home has extended or violence has extended all over the place, and we need to do that. And the laws are being passed. There are kind of 2013 law was there, which talks of sexual violence against women, how Me Too movement has begun. So we also need that women have started talking about this, and state also has responding, but very, very minimally. So we need really to make these effective voices about the society, about policy, and about women themselves. It is not sole responsibility of women, I don't think so, that kind of thing. But I think since women are at the receiving end, so they have to come forward in kind of openly talking about what kind, how violence is affecting them. So that is what I wanted to share, but I'm not summing up this kind of such complex, comprehensive kind of and very explicit in explaining the problems talk and the comments by the Professor Rajeshwari, Professor Doris Gray, and Professor Nalli. Thank you very much.
Professor Kumar, your concluding remarks on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think thank you so much to everybody for all the questions and for the valuable comments, questions that the discussants and Professor Kelkar raised. I think honestly, it is very, very comprehensive and very complex and very vast. So at this point in time, my mental state is like, wow, there is so much, like, despite the work that you do and you find out the pieces, I just feel that I go back to this argument that more and more we need to encourage having these forums to have conversations and to make these conversations more accessible. So this is great that we are having this conversation and we have this discourse, but in how many communities, homes, organizations are there opportunities to have this kind of discussion? And can we create those forums? Can we allow for those safe spaces for people to talk? And there's just one incident that comes to my mind. There is this 16-year-old young girl that I know who wrote about her notion of feminism and why feminism is important or necessary in India and how she understands this. And there were a whole lot of things that she talked about, which is, of course, gender-based violence at home or otherwise and everything. And then she takes that note and she talks to somebody else who is much older than her, another woman. And the person says, well, this is not relevant to India. And so you see the 16-year-old, she is now confused that I thought this is relevant. This is how I understand this. But when she goes to somebody who is much older than her in her own family setup, that person just dismisses it. Or there are other people in her own family construct who are just saying, hey, I don't think this is the right way you're seeing it. And she's lost. She's like, but this is how I see it. What do I do? So I think even at home, if I look at it, are we making spaces to have these conversations? Maybe this was not your discourse when you were growing up 20 years ago or 40 years ago. It was not possible for you to have this conversation within your family construct. But today, if that young girl or boy is having a conversation and raising some very pertinent questions, maybe it is not something you thought about. But is it possible for you to not be dismissive? Is it possible for you to not push back? Because I think that becomes the beginning of shutting down, of silencing people. And when we keep doing that again and again, then tomorrow when, unfortunately, if there's something bad happens, that person is not going to run to the family because they know what are the views of the family members and how they would be judged or responded in that scenario. So I think it just feels like while we do other things externally, what is it that we can do in our own homes? What is it that I can do with the people that I am in touch with? So I have a privilege of working and interacting with a lot of young minds because of my teaching. I constantly give them those spaces to raise these questions, to talk about whether it is sexual violence, whether it is partner abuse, whether it is, dating violence or whatever it is. Can we foster those kind of conversations? So that probably is what is right now in my mind, but I'm sure as the time passes, there will be a lot of things I would think about. And yes, Dr. Kelkar, I always think about how and when we can end this. And honestly, I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. Thank you so much. This was a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kumar and Professor Kelkar. And you rightly said it's very hard to sum up or conclude something to this discussion where it's just so vast, and it's a discussion that's meant to be had continuously. And I can safely say that this has been one of the most engaging and meaningful discussions we've had at IMPRI as part of this series, and where we've explored the many paradoxes of work and intimate partner violence, and how work can play such roles of such conflicting nature for women, middle-class women who are going through abuse at their homes. We've talked about family and community support, and how the lack of support from family of origin can just be so hollowing. And then legal and economic empowerment, not just in terms of access to resources, but also control of those resources, whether it's finances, whether it's land, and many other things. And then, of course, the responsibilities of organizations in terms of really showing up for their employees going through abuse at home. So thank you again, Professor Smitha Kumar, for that deeply, deeply powerful and engaging talk. And thank you for helping us create a space for discussing this. Thank you also to our chair, Professor Govind Kilkar, for enriching the discussion with her comments as always. Thank you to our discussants, Dr. Doris Gray, Dr. Nandani Mudali, Dr. B. Rajeshwari, and everyone at IMPRI, the whole IMPRI team, GenDev Center for Research and Innovation, Delhi Post, and everyone who joined in today through Zoom, through Facebook Live, for bringing up such pertinent questions. And if you're watching later on YouTube, thank you. And thank you for joining the discussion. And we hope you tune in to our future episodes of Gender Gaps as well. So with that, I think we can take away a lot from this discussion. And with that, food for thought, very good evening.
Yes, Kilkar ma'am, would you like to say anything?
No, I've said enough. Thank you, Arjun. I think you should say something. We needed somebody like you are a very sensitive person and you have been keeping quiet.
No, ma'am, I'm just trying for all of you to speak. I speak a lot.
We can speak, there are no doubt, but yeah, I think we need some men's voices also in support.
No, I really wanted to ask, but Sunidhi asked that what levers do we have in terms of policy? Because we are talking about agencies, institutions, but many of places when there is economic penalty or there is sensitization. So what are those levers we can work with the policymakers, or even because we have funds, and I'm really raised that parties are coming and going, and but we are not able to make use of any funds for any of this positive thing or constructive thing, be it even any forum. We are having so many of civil society organization and everything. Still there is so much of lack that process Smita has, not only from the point of our subcontinent, but in Africa, Latin America, all parts of the world. There is so much of loneliness, especially for conversing these things. And as we all live in democracies, I think, discussing or conversing is the first very primary steps. But let me congratulate Professor Smita Kumar for choosing this very tough topic. I was really amused and amazed to even understand the topic when we sent it. So we had a long discussion but I really requested ma'am to shed light upon all these basic issues also, so that we all can understand. And thank you so much, Professor Gray, for joining us from Berlin, Germany, and Dr. Nandani Mudali for joining here, and also Professor B. Rajeshwari for joining and asking all the pertinent question, and Kilkar ma'am, Govind ma'am, thank you so much for leading this kind of deliberation. It's really not my cup of tea. And Anshula, yes, thank you. Very good job. Have a nice day.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.